Father in heaven, we thank you so much for revealing to us the end from the beginning. We are so thankful that we don't live in a time of uncertainty where we don't know where things are leading. You have said in your word how history would develop and how history will end. And we know that it will be a glorious end for those who love you. So I ask, Father, that you will inspire us through a study of Bible prophecy and that you will help us to remain faithful to you no matter what. We thank you, Father, for your presence, and we ask this in the precious name of Jesus. Amen. Well, let's review the prophetic chain that we have been studying. The prophetic chain begins with which kingdom? Babylon. Very well. Then you have a second kingdom, which is Medo-Persia. Then you have a third kingdom, Greece. Then you have a fourth kingdom, the Roman Empire. And then what happens with the Roman Empire? The Roman Empire is divided. In other words, this fourth beast sprouts 10 horns. The empire is divided. Then among the 10 horns rises what? The little horn. Is that also a Rome? Yes. Which Rome? It is papal Rome. And it rules from 538 till 1798. What happens in 1798 with the little horn or the beast? It receives a deadly wound and it is sent into captivity because it can no longer use the civil powers of the world. Now, when this first beast falls in 1798, immediately after rises another beast. Remember that? From the earth. And we identified that beast as which nation? The United States of America. And we identified the two horns like a lamb as the two kingdoms that are recognized in this one nation. And what are those two kingdoms that are recognized in this country, the United States of America? The kingdom of the church and the kingdom of the state. The church has its sword, the Word of God, and the state has its sword with which it can punish violations of civil law. Now, as I mentioned at the close of our last study together, we are going to now look at the origins of the United States of America. And we're going to see if the founding fathers had this idea of the United States being different than the history that we find in Europe during the 1260 years. We're going to try and see if the two horns like a lamb represent separation of church and state, civil and religious liberty, like we studied in our last lecture from the Bible. But I want you to notice once again that we are following a chain of events. Can you follow the trajectory of Bible prophecy? Is it actually quite simple? Sure. You can go from Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is divided into 10 kingdoms. Then the papacy rules for 1260 years till 1798. And around 1798, another nation rises who upholds these two principles, which are civil and religious liberty, which depends on the idea of the separation of church and state. Are you with me? And then we're going to find that after a period of time, this very nation is going to restore freedom and is going to help the wound of the first beast to heal. Now, we haven't come to that point yet, but that's the last link in the chain before the greatest event of all, which is the second coming of Jesus in power and glory. Now, let's go to our material. There is a syllabus for this particular series, and those who are watching the live streaming and those who will see this on YouTube and those who will get the DVDs, you want to get the syllabus as well because you'll be able to follow along all of the quotations and so on in the syllabus. The Constitutional Fathers knew four things. When I talk about the Constitutional Fathers, I'm talking about the founders of the United States. People like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, etc. They knew four things we know from their writings. Number one, they knew that the apostate Jewish church had influenced the Roman state to kill Christ. They knew the union of the apostate church with the civil power of Rome, that is, with Pontius Pilate to slay Christ. They also knew that in the early church, as it's told in the story of the book of Acts, that the Jewish church, the same apostate church that influenced the state to destroy Christ, they knew that that church continued appealing to the Roman emperors to persecute, and rulers, to persecute the disciples or the apostles who were preaching God's message after the ascension of Christ. They also knew the history of the church during the Dark Ages, during the 1260 years. The Founding Fathers described quite frequently, for example, the Inquisition. They knew that persecution had come during the 1260 years because the church had linked with the state, and it had gotten the state to persecute those who did not agree with its doctrines and its practices. They also knew the history of the colonial period of the United States, which begins officially in the year 1620 when the Pilgrims came to the United States. Well, actually, there was no United States, but they came to the territory of the United States. They came seeking religious liberty, and then once they had it, they denied it to anybody who did not agree with them. Anybody that did not belong to the established church, which was the Puritan church, a branch of the Anglican church. And so the Founding Fathers knew about the colonial period. They knew that in the colonial period, if you didn't go to church on Sunday, you could be fined and you could be thrown into prison. And in at least 3 of the colonies, there was a death decree against those who did not attend church on Sunday because they believed Sunday was the day of rest. You could not occupy a position in the civil government if you did not belong to the established church. And only ministers that belonged to the established church could be remunerated for their efforts, because people basically gave their tithes to the government paid the ministers. But the only ministers that were paid were the ones that belonged to the established church. So if you were not a minister of an established church, you would have to find another means of sustenance. In other words, in the colonial period, the Founding Fathers knew that there had been a union of church and state, and the result had been persecution against those who were not in harmony with this arrangement. So we need to understand the founding documents of the United States within this historical context. The United States was not established in a vacuum. In other words, it doesn't simply appear with its principles on the scene all of a sudden. It is a reaction to the colonial period, the 1260 years, and the persecution against the apostles and Christ by uniting church and state. We have to understand that historical context in order to comprehend the style of government that was established in the United States by the Founding Fathers. And so it was that in 1776, the Declaration of Independence of the United States was signed. And among other things, it stated that human beings are guaranteed certain inalienable rights. That means rights that God gives that nobody can take away from you. Certain inalienable rights, which are among those rights, are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In 1787, the Constitution of the United States was ratified. And the basic idea of the Constitution is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. In other words, the people govern themselves through the election of representatives by themselves. And then in 1791, the Bill of Rights was ratified, which are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution of the United States. And the Bill of Rights, among other things, guarantees full civil and religious liberty. It's interesting to note that these 3 documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, were ratified immediately before the beast received its deadly wound. In other words, when the beast was about to receive its deadly wound, the next power coming onto the world scene was rising. Isn't that interesting? In the light of what we studied from Revelation chapter 13, where it says that the beast receives a deadly wound, then I saw another beast rising from the earth. So we know that the beast that rises from the earth rises around the year 1798. Now, in this new nation, there was a basic idea, and that is that there are 2 legitimate kingdoms that could exist in the United States of America. One was the church, and the other one was the state. The church would have its spiritual sword, which is the Bible. And the state would have the civil sword with which it could punish violations of civil law. These 2 principles upon which this nation was established are called republicanism And that has nothing to do with the Republican Party, by the way. It's a republic. In other words, it's a Republican style of government. Basically means a representative civil government with the civil sword. And then you have Protestantism, which is a representative religious government with the religious sword. During the Middle Ages, in all civil matters, the king ruled. If the king said, jump, you could only say, how high? Because all of the power flowed from the king downward. The king had the last word, and what the king ordered, people did in civil affairs. In religious affairs, the Pope was the one who had the last words. If the Pope said jump, you better say, how high do you want me to jump? Because anything having to do with religion, when the Pope spoke or the papacy spoke, people were expected to obey blindly in religious matters, even if it conflicted with their individual conscience. In other words, all of the power during the period of the 1260 years flowed from top to bottom, from the king down to the people, and from the Pope down to the people as well. The founding fathers of the United States said, we're going to establish a different kind of government. Dare I use the word, a revolutionary type of government. A government that goes against all of the conventions that have been tried in the past. A government where the power does not flow from top to bottom, but where the power flows from bottom to top. Where instead of a king telling people what to do in civil matters, and a pope telling people what to do in religious matters, the people can decide by electing representatives what they are going to believe, what they are going to practice, so that they can govern themselves. Are you understanding the difference? So the founding fathers were trying a revolutionary experiment that had not been tried before. Because in previous empires, the king was the one who ruled in civil matters, and the Pope was the one who ruled in religious matters. So the founding fathers said, no, what we're going to do, there are going to be two kingdoms in this nation. There's going to be the church, and there's going to be the state. And both of these kingdoms are going to be separate from one another, and they are going to be based on the idea of freedom. Freedom of religion and freedom in civil matters. Ellen White, who wrote this classic book, Great Controversy, on page 442, and I must say Ellen White was born only 29 years after the deadly wound. So she was very close to the time of the deadly wound. She wrote this about the ideas that the founders had. The founders of the nation wisely sought to guard against the employment of secular power on the part of the church, with its inevitable result, which is what? Intolerance and persecution. So what did the founding fathers want to keep away from? They wanted to keep away from the church being able to use the state. And when that happens, what is the result? According to what she says, the result is what? Intolerance and persecution. If you don't believe that the union of church and state leads to persecution and intolerance, all you have to go is to Muslim countries. There the church and the state are one. Let me ask you this. If the church and the state are joined together, will you lose both civil and religious liberties? Yes, you will. Because if you do not agree with the religion, you'll be killed, and the greatest civil right you have is life. Are you with me? So they are linked together. In other words, if you don't believe in full religious liberty and full civil liberty, church and state separate from one another, the end result is going to be, as Ellen White says, intolerance and what? And persecution. In this way, the founding fathers rejected the view of the Roman Catholic Church. The view that the church can use the state to force people into believing and practicing what the church believes and practices. So now what we want to do is take a look at the writings of some of the founding fathers of the United States to see if they believed in the idea of the separation of church and state, the church functioning as church and the state functioning as state, and thus guaranteeing full civil and religious liberty. Let's begin with Mr. Liberty himself, George Washington. George Washington is an individual that stands out for three primary reasons. Number one, he was the liberator of the United States from British rule. Number two, he was the first president of the United States, of the nation of the United States. And number three, he presided over the Constitutional Convention that drafted and implemented and ratified the Constitution of the United States. So I would say that he would be a very important individual in the history of the original history of the United States. Now, the Baptist delegation of Virginia wrote a letter to George Washington on August 8, 1779. And they congratulated him for being elected president of the United States. And they asked him if the Constitution that was ratified in 1787 guaranteed full civil and religious liberty if it didn't have a Bill of Rights. See, the Bill of Rights had not yet been implemented, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So Washington wrote back to them, reassuring the Baptists that they didn't have to worry, that the Constitution guaranteed full civil and religious liberty without necessarily having a Bill of Rights. And I want to read to you what George Washington said about this idea of the Constitution not having a Bill of Rights and the Constitution guaranteeing civil and religious liberty in spite of not having a Bill of Rights. And I read now from George Washington. He stated this: if I could have entertained the slightest apprehension that the Constitution framed by the convention where I had the honor to preside might possibly endanger the religious rights of any ecclesiastical society, certainly I would never have placed my signature on it. And if I could now conceive that the general government is the federal government, that's the way they called it back then. And if I could now conceive that the general government might ever be so administered as to render the liberty of conscience insecure, I beg you will be persuaded that no one would be more zealous than myself to establish effectual barriers against the horrors of spiritual tyranny and every species of religious persecution. For you, doubtless remember, I have often expressed my sentiments that any man conducting himself as a good citizen, what kingdom does that have to do with? The civil power. Conducting himself as a good citizen and being accountable to God alone for his religious opinion, what kingdom does that have to do with? The religious kingdom or the church kingdom. Ought to be what? Protected in worshiping the deity according to the dictates of his own conscience. Did George Washington believe that there were two kingdoms? He most certainly did. Did he believe that you could be a good citizen and also you should be protected in your religious liberty? Absolutely. Now let's notice what Benjamin Franklin had to say. And I'm just choosing a sprinkling of the writings of the founding fathers of the United States. There are many more that I could read. In fact, I have a syllabus that is available from Secrets Unsealed where I have about 15 pages of quotations from the founding fathers. I've only chosen a few of them. Benjamin Franklin had a sense of humor. He wrote this: when religion is good, I conceive that it will support itself. And when it does not support itself, and God does not take care to support it, so that its professors are obliged to call for the help of the civil powers, 'tis a sign I apprehend of it being a bad one. Are you understanding what he's saying? He's saying that the church should not appeal to the power of the what? Of the state. Is this separation of church and state? Did Benjamin Franklin believe in the separation of church and state? Now you say, were the founding fathers inimical to religion? Were they enemies of religion? No. They said the only thing that the federal government can do is protect everyone's right to practice their religion without state interference. That's the only thing that the federal government can do with regards to religion, is protect everyone's right to practice their religion freely without the intervention of the civil power. Now let's notice what Thomas Jefferson had to say. I've been to the Jefferson Memorial many times in Washington, D.C. It's one of my favorite places to visit. It's this great big mausoleum type structure with white marble. And some of the famous sayings of Thomas Jefferson are written on the walls in the white marble. And one day I sat down and I wrote with my own hand one of those quotations. So the quotation I'm going to read now, I did not get out of a book. I sat down and I wrote it myself there at the Jefferson Memorial. I want you to notice what he said about religion and the civil power. Almighty God hath created the mind free. All attempts to influence it by temporal punishment or burdens are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion. Does he already believe in the separation of church and state there? Yes. He says yes. You can't, the secular power cannot, by punishment or burdens, get people to follow a certain belief. That's a departure of God's plan, is what he's saying. He continues writing, no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship or ministry, or shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief. But all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matter of religion. I know but one code of morality for men, whether acting singly or collectively. Did Thomas Jefferson believe that the civil power had no right to impose burdens or punishments on people because of their religious convictions? Yes. So did he believe in the separation of church and state? He most certainly did. Jefferson also wrote the following, and this is almost a humorous statement that he made. The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. Does the state have the right to punish someone who steals from somebody else? Does it have a right to punish someone who kills somebody else? Does it have a right to punish someone who ruins the reputation of somebody else? Does it have a right to punish children who abuse their parents? Yes, those are acts that a civil government can punish. But notice what he says. The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. And then he says this, it does me no injury for my neighbor to say that there are 20 gods or no gods. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Are you understanding what he's saying? Now, he also wrote in 1782, it is error alone which needs the support of government. Truth can stand by itself. Did he believe in the separation of truth, religious truth, and government? He most certainly did. He also understood the dangers of the clergy getting involved in the political system. Notice these next two statements that we find here. He says, the clergy, by getting themselves established by law, see they're involved in the political system, and engrafted into the machine of government, have been a very formidable engine against the civil and religious rights of man. Did Thomas Jefferson understand the dangers of uniting church and state? You better believe he did. He says, you can see it, that when a priesthood gets involved, engrafted into the government, the result is a loss of civil and religious liberties. He also said this, and this is very interesting. History, I believe, furnishes no example of a priest-ridden people maintaining a free civil government. Isn't that a powerful statement? One more statement. This was in 1814. He said, in every country and in every age, the priest has been hostile to liberty. He is always in alliance with the despot, abetting his abuses in return for protection to his own. Thomas Jefferson knew very well what happened when the church was able to use the state. And he said, in this country, it will not be that way. We are going to establish a different government where the civil government governs in civil matters and the church deals with religious matters, and every man and woman are free to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience. Now, the Danbury Baptist Association of Connecticut wrote President Thomas Jefferson on October 7, 1801, to complain that their rights were being infringed by their state legislature, their religious rights. And this is part of the letter that they wrote to Thomas Jefferson. What religious privileges we enjoy as a minor part of the state, in other words, they were a minority in the state, we enjoy as favors granted and not as inalienable rights. Now, the government is saying, well, we'll grant you religious freedom, but religious freedom is a divine right. It cannot be, religious liberty cannot be granted by the government because it's something that God has given man. It's an inalienable right. But they're complaining. They're saying, you know, what happens is the state is saying, we'll grant you these rights. They're saying, no, the state can't grant us these rights. They're in an inalienable right. So once again, what religious privileges we enjoy as a minor part of the state, we enjoy as favors granted and not as inalienable rights. And these favors we receive at the expense of such degrading acknowledgments as are inconsistent with the rights of free men. Now, on the month of January of 1802, Thomas Jefferson answered their letter. And he explained very clearly his understanding of the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And this is where the wall metaphor comes from. Have you heard of the wall metaphor, the wall of separation? Well, let's read this statement so that you can see what Thomas Jefferson said. Believing with you, that is with the Danbury Baptists, that religion is a matter which lies solely, that is only, between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach what? Actions only and not opinions. I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that the legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And then he explains, by the way, he's quoting the First Amendment. Then he says, thus building what? A wall of separation between church and state. Did Thomas Jefferson believe that the church should function as church and the state as state separately? He most certainly did. All of the founding fathers believed this. And that's why I've dedicated this whole lecture to show that the two horns like a lamb are corroborated by the history, the original history of the United States. Now, let's talk a little bit about James Madison. James Madison is called the father of the Constitution. He's the brains behind the Constitution, in other words. Let's read a few statements from James Madison. He wrote this: there is not a shadow of right in the general government, remember it's the federal government, the general government to intermeddle with religion. Did he believe that the federal government could get involved in religion? No, no, no. He says there's not a shadow of right in the general government to intermeddle with religion. Its least interference with it, that is with religion, would be a most flagrant usurpation. I can appeal to my uniform conduct on this subject that I have warmly supported religious freedom. Did he believe in the separation of church and state? He most certainly did. In 1822, this is very interesting because the United States was established in 1776, 1787, 1791. This is about 30-some years after the experiment had been tried. And so James Madison now writes about lessons that the United States is teaching the world. Notice what he wrote. We are teaching the world the great truth that governments do better without kings and nobles than with them. In other words, a republic is a better idea, is what he's saying, than a monarchy. And then he says, the merit will be doubled. By the other lesson, that religion flourishes in greater purity without than with the aid of government. Isn't that a telling statement? So interesting. Sometimes I ask people, to how many kingdoms do you belong? Well, you know, I was born in the United States, so I am a citizen of the United States. But I was baptized as Seventh-day Adventist, so I am also a citizen of the heavenly kingdom. I live in one nation, but I'm a citizen of two kingdoms in the United States, each separate from the other. In other words, the federal government cannot interfere with my religious convictions. And the church should not be involved in trying to use the state to violate people's religious convictions, because the state has its legitimate existence and the church also has its legitimate existence. Now let's talk a little bit about the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Some Christians today, many of them will say, well, the expression separation of church and state is not found anywhere in the Constitution. And that's true. If you're looking for the phrase separation of church and state in the Constitution, you're not going to find it because it's not there. But the concept of the separation of church and state is in the Constitution, in the First Amendment to the Constitution, in fact. Let's read the First Amendment to the Constitution. By the way, in this amendment is where you find the two horns like a lamb, because this amendment guarantees religious liberty and civil liberty and separates the two. Let's notice the First Amendment. Congress. What does Congress do? It writes the laws, right? Congress shall make no law. Now, what part of no law don't you understand? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Notice that doesn't say that Congress can't make a law that establishes a church above other churches, or that establishes one religion above another religion. That's the way many Christians today are interpreting. They're saying, well, the Founding Fathers, when they say that Congress shall not make, Congress shall not make any law that establishes religion, they were really meaning that the United States could not establish one church above another or one religion above another, but the federal government can benefit all churches alike. That's the argument. But the fact is that the word religion does not have a definite article. It doesn't say church, it says religion. It doesn't say a religion, it says religion. Are you following me? So it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the what? The free exercise thereof. What does this mean? It means that Congress can't make any law that establishes any religious observance. And it means that it cannot make any law that forbids you from practicing your religion. It cannot establish any religious observance, and it cannot forbid you from practicing freely your religion. And you say, well, what's the difference? In the Bible, we find two examples of the first two clauses of the First Amendment. In Daniel chapter 3, when Nebuchadnezzar raised the golden image, was he establishing a religious observance by law? Was the civil power establishing a religious observance? Absolutely he was. Was that legitimate or illegitimate? It was illegitimate. The civil power cannot enforce religion, cannot establish religion. What came as a result of establishing religion? Persecution, right? In Daniel 6, we have also another story that illustrates the free exercise clause. You see, in Daniel chapter 6, the issue is not that the king Darius is establishing a religious observance. He's forbidding people from praying. He's forbidding the free exercise of religion. And when he forbade the free exercise of religion, what was the result? Persecution. So Daniel 3 and Daniel 6 illustrate the first two clauses to the First Amendment. When the government establishes a religious observance, persecution. When the government or Congress, the government through Congress, forbids the free exercise of religion, the result is what? Persecution. The Founding Fathers knew this. And therefore, the Founding Fathers put in this First Amendment that Congress could not make any law establishing any religious observance. And it could not forbid people's right to exercise their religion freely without the interference of government. Now, the third clause of the First Amendment guarantees civil rights. So here you have the two horns like a lamb. Religious liberty and what? Civil liberty. Notice what the last part of the First Amendment says. Or abridging the freedom of speech. Is that a civil right? Freedom of speech, is that a civil right? Yes. Or of the press, is that a civil right? Yes, it is. Or the right of the people to peaceably assemble, is that a civil right? Yes. And to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Can you ask the government to do you justice? Yes, you can. The last clause of the First Amendment deals with civil rights. The first two clauses deal with what? With religious rights. In other words, the First Amendment to the Constitution clearly establishes a distinction between religion and the civil power. Are you understanding what I'm saying? Now, let's talk a little bit about the Supreme Court of the United States. The Seventh-day Adventist Church believes, and in our next two lectures we're going to discuss this more fully, and we're going to prove it from the Bible. The Seventh-day Adventist Church believes that the United States will ultimately, Congress will ultimately write a law mandating the observance of Sunday as the day of rest. And eventually we will reach the point where Congress will write a law that will forbid the observance of the Sabbath as the day of rest. And some people say, oh, that could never happen in these United States of America. Because the First Amendment says, Congress shall not make any law that establishes religion, nor any law that forbids the free exercise. So if Congress wrote a law that everybody has to keep Sunday, would that be a violation of the First Amendment? Would that be establishing religion? Even a kindergartner could understand that. If the government should forbid, if the Congress should make a law forbidding you to keep the Sabbath, would that be a violation of the second clause, free exercise, to keep the day that you want? Of course it would. Any person, any rational person would understand that. And so you say, how is it possible that the United States, through its Congress, would write a law establishing religion and forbidding the free exercise thereof when it has guaranteed civil and religious liberty? Well, let me ask you, how is it possible that a beast that has two horns like a lamb talks like a dragon? It's a contradictory nation. In other words, it's going to contradict its profession. In action, it is going to do totally opposite of what it professes in its founding principles. Now you say, how is that possible that the United States would ever write a law that would violate the First Amendment to the Constitution? Well, in order to understand how this might happen, we must take a look at the style of government of the United States. The United States, like many other nations, has three branches. The first branch, of course, is the legislative branch. The legislative branch writes and passes laws. Then you have the executive branch. The executive branch, the president and all of the individuals that work with him are the ones that are required to enforce the laws that are written by Congress. And then you have the judicial branch, primarily the Supreme Court, that interprets the laws to determine whether those laws are constitutional or not. In other words, the purpose of the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, is to decide if a law that's been written by Congress is constitutional or not. Now, if I were to ask you which is the most powerful branch of government in the United States, what would you answer? Well, many people say, well, it would be the Congress because they write the laws. Others would say, well, you know, it'd be the president because the president is required to enforce the laws. But really the most powerful branch of government is the judicial branch, primarily the Supreme Court. Now, do you know how the Supreme Court of the United States is composed today? You know, the Supreme Court has 9 justices. We only have 8 because Antonin Scalia died. and they haven't elected, this big fight. And by the way, this is the most important part of the next election, I believe, is whoever wins will appoint probably 3 Supreme Court justices, because Ginsburg and Breyer and Kennedy are up in years. And so the next president probably, if the president is there for 2 terms, is probably going to elect 3 Supreme Court justices, which will totally transform the court. So anyway, I'm not making a political speech or anything. I'm just saying that it's extremely important how the Supreme Court is composed. The United States is called a Protestant nation, but there's not one Protestant on the Supreme Court. There are 5 Roman Catholics and 3 Jews on the Supreme Court. And Antonin Scalia was a Roman Catholic. So when he was alive, there were 5 Roman Catholics and 3 Jews in a country that says that it is Protestant. Not one Protestant on the Supreme Court. Now you say, how do you know that the Supreme Court is the most powerful branch of government? Let me give you a couple of examples. Do you remember the election in the year 2000 in Florida? The hanging chads? Remember they were looking at the cards in the light to see which Chad they had punched, to see if they voted for Al Gore or for George Bush. Remember that? You know, for several weeks we didn't know who had won the election. It would go from one lawyer to another. It would go from one court of law to another court of law, then to a higher court of law. Finally, the case went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said George Bush won the election in Florida. So basically, the Supreme Court elected the President of the United States of America. Let me give you another example. June 26. That's the anniversary tomorrow. It's my birthday, June 26. On June 26 of last year, the Supreme Court stated that gay marriage is something that is going to be legal all across the United States of America. Who can contest that? Who can question that decision of the Supreme Court? What court can you appeal it to? You can't appeal it to any court. So when the Supreme Court says the case was taken, gay marriage is something that is a right guaranteed in all 50 states, there's no court of appeal. That is what is going to happen. So let me ask you this. If the Supreme Court is willing to redefine marriage, contrary to the Bible definition, you don't think that the Supreme Court would be willing to redefine the day of worship? Of course it would. It will be in a time of national emergency. It'll be a time of great difficulty. And you know, there are trying times that are going to come to this country, folks. People don't have the foggiest idea what is going to happen. There's going to be an economic meltdown. There's going to be more terrorist attacks. There's going to be more so-called natural disasters. And it's not due to climate change and all of these reasons that are being given. The fact is that God is withdrawing His Spirit from this country. Because this country has said, we don't want God. We don't want His Word. We don't want you in our life, is what this country has said. And so God says, you don't want me? I'm not going to force myself on you. And He removes Himself from those who have rejected and said that they don't want Him in their lives. And human beings can be very cruel when they're devoid of the Spirit of God. And of course, after the close of probation, Ellen White describes this world. She says that there's a scene of strife such as no pen can picture. Can you imagine what the world is going to be like with Satan in total control of the finally impenitent? He won't be in control of God's people, but he will be in control of all of the wicked in the world. We haven't seen anything yet compared to what is coming. And the world, even the Protestant world, you know, they say, well, it's the Muslims and it's the terrorists, and you know, they blame everything. It's climate change. And they applaud the Pope. They say, wow, the Pope, he's got it straight, you know. We need to emphasize the poor, and we need to emphasize the family, and we need to emphasize climate change. He's got it right. And they don't realize that the reason why everything is going downhill is because God is withdrawing His Spirit from the earth. He's releasing the winds of strife. That's what's really happening in this nation. This nation, if it was to return to God, it would have to return to what God says in His Word. Now, I'm not talking against people. You know, if people want to live a gay lifestyle, you know, I believe the government should give them that civil liberty. But the government does not have any right to redefine marriage, because the Bible defines marriage as between a man and a woman. If gay people want to have civil unions, and I think they should get tax breaks, just like people who are married. But God has defined marriage as between a man and a woman. And how is it that man or the Supreme Court would redefine marriage? And you don't think that the United States, through its Congress, would also be able to redefine the meaning of God's day of worship? You say, well, Pastor Bohr, how is that possible? In the United States of America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, something like that could happen? Listen, the beast of Revelation 13, it says it has two horns like a lamb, but it speaks like a dragon. Listen carefully. It doesn't say that the two horns are broken and then it speaks like a dragon. It speaks like a dragon while it still has the two horns. In other words, this nation is not going to get rid of the First Amendment to the Constitution. It's going to say we still uphold the First Amendment. But what is going to happen is that unconstitutional laws will be declared constitutional. Are you with me? And that's why we need to defend the Constitution of the United States as it was given originally. The Founding Fathers believed in the separation of church and state. They believed that the civil power could not make any law having to do with religion, either enforcing any religious observance or forbidding the right of people to practice their religion. Am I making myself clear? Now let me talk to you here about John Adams and the Treaty of Tripoli. You say, what is that? The Treaty of Tripoli? What in the world could that mean? Well, on June 10, 1797, 1 year before the deadly wound, actually less than a year before the deadly wound, John Adams signed into law what is known as the Treaty of Tripoli. And I'm going to read only the one line that we find in this treaty, which is significant to our discussion. The government of the United States is not in any sense founded upon the Christian religion. The government of the United States is not what? In any sense founded upon the Christian religion. This Treaty of Tripoli has really bothered a lot of evangelicals and conservative Protestants in the United States, because they want to say that the foundation of the United States is a Judeo-Christian foundation. But the fact is, the Founding Fathers knew that if the United States was founded on the Christian religion, that would be unconstitutional, because it would be establishing religion. Would it not? It would be establishing religion to say that the United States is established upon the Christian religion. They knew that. Incidentally, this treaty in May of 1797, right before John Adams signed it into law, it was read before the Senate. A written copy was given to every senator. It was approved unanimously by the Senate without one dissenting vote. It was published in the great newspapers of Philadelphia and New York. Those were the big cities back then. There was not a whimper of protest from anyone, no letter from anyone protesting. What do you mean the United States is not founded on the Christian religion? The fact is that the United States was a nation composed by a majority of Christians. But it is not a Christian nation. It's not founded on Christianity, because if it was founded on Christianity, that would be unconstitutional, because the government cannot establish any religion. Are you with me or not? So the Founding Fathers knew what they were doing. Ellen White, who was born only 29 years after the deadly wound, wrote in 1888 about the secret of the power and prosperity of the United States of America. Listen to what she wrote. Among the Christian exiles who first fled to America and sought an asylum, why did they come here? An asylum from what? From royal oppression. That has to do with the king, right? They were fleeing the style of government that had kings. And priestly intolerance. Was there also intolerance on the part of the church? Absolutely, because the church had a pope, see? So they were fleeing from the idea of having a king in civil matters and a pope in religious matters. She says, were many who determined to establish a government upon the broad foundation of what? Civil and religious liberty. Their views found place in the Declaration of Independence, which sets forth the great truth that all men are created equal and endowed with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Constitution guarantees to the people the right of self-government, providing that representatives elected by the popular vote shall enact laws and administer the laws. Freedom of religious faith, First Amendment, right? Freedom of religious faith was also granted, in every man being permitted to worship God according to the dictates of his conscience. Republicanism, which is basically a state without a king, and Protestantism, a church without a pope, became the fundamental principles of the nation. And now notice this ominous statement. These principles are the secret of its power and prosperity. Have you ever read those statements where Ellen White says that when the Sunday law is proposed, that will lead to national apostasy, and national apostasy will lead to national ruin? That's what she's describing. It's not when people say the United States is so great because it had greater armies, bigger territory, more people, more money. All of those are side issues. The secret of the power and prosperity of the United States are these two principles upon which the nation was founded. If the nation someday should join church and state, if someday the United States should allow the church to control the civil government, to persecute those who do not agree with the general ideas of religion, the United States would be repudiating the two horns like a lamb and would begin speaking like a dragon. And that would bring forth the retribution of God against this country that was established by God's providence. This country was raised in God's providence. Praise the Lord that for 200 years this country has abided by its principles. It's been possible to proclaim present truth to the whole world from this nation because it has abided by its principles. It almost makes me want to cry to think of what's going to happen to this nation according to what Bible prophecy has to say. Now you look at what's happening today, it seems like the state has power over the church. You know, like State Bill 1146. You know, the state is going to dictate to religious universities. You know, you have to go by the LGBT agenda, or else you're going to lose support. So it appears that the state is interfering more with the church than the church with the state. But prophecy tells us that that is going to change. Eventually, what's going to happen is you're going to have an image of what happened during the Middle Ages. The church is going to control the state, and the church is going to dictate to the state religious laws, and those who do not abide by those religious laws will be persecuted. So let me ask you then, do the founding fathers of the United States agree with what Bible prophecy has to say? Did they believe in two principles? Did they believe in the idea of civil liberty, which, by the way, means that you believe in a civil government? Did they believe in religious liberty, which has to do with the church? Did they believe that both of these things must remain separate in order for there to be full civil and religious liberty? We have examined their writings. Their writings corroborate our interpretation of the prophecy of Revelation chapter 13. Have you understood what we've studied? So where are we in the prophetic chain? Well, let's review again. My wife says, you review too much. You repeat too much. And I tell my wife, listen, how does a parrot learn to talk? You repeat and repeat and repeat to the parrot, and the parrot learns to say it. So you got to repeat. So let's examine the chain again. Where does the chain begin? Babylon. Then Medo-Persia. Then Greece. Then the Roman Empire. What happens to the Roman Empire? It's divided into 10 kingdoms. Then the papacy rules for how long? 1,260 years. What happens at the end of 1,260 years? The papacy receives a deadly wound with a sword. The state turns against it. And the papacy is sent into what? Captivity, because it can no longer use the civil powers of the world to accomplish its purposes. When the papacy falls, this other beast rises from the earth, the United States of America, with the 2 horns like a lamb. In other words, it guarantees full civil and religious liberty by the idea of the separation of church and state. Where are we in the prophetic chain? What is the next event in the prophetic chain? The next event in the prophetic chain is that this beast from the earth that has 2 horns like a lamb will end up speaking like a dragon. We are at the very final end of the chain, at the final link. And the United States will speak like a dragon because it will help the beast recover its power. Remember what we said? It will tell everyone to worship the first beast, to make an image of the first beast, to enforce the mark of the first beast. It will do everything on behalf of the first beast. It will exercise the authority of the first beast. In other words, the United States will restore the idea of uniting church and state that existed with the papacy and the civil powers of Europe during the 1,260 years. Now don't miss the next couple of lectures, because we're going to unpack this a little bit more. We're going to talk about the mark of the beast. We're going to talk about the change in God's law as the defining issue at the end of time. So don't miss for anything in the world the next exciting episode in this